the storm hit without warning, turning the quiet Montana evening into a blizzard. Fiona Jenkins, the hospital's least noticed employee, felt a familiar tension rise in her chest. The sound of the snow hammering against the windows reminded her of a different time, a time when she had been more than just a nurse. At 54, she had come to be known as just another graying woman in the corner, mopping up spills and taking orders. But deep within her, the old reflexes of a combat medic, honed in the deserts of Fallujah, still remained. She had buried that part of herself for years, but now, as the wind howled outside and the storm trapped them all in, Fiona felt the stirrings of a storm inside her. The ER was empty for now, but the moment felt like a prelude to chaos. She glanced at her watch. Shift change wasn't for another hour, but she already knew something was coming, something big, and Fiona Jenkins was ready. The phone rang, a shrill, urgent sound that sliced through the silence. She picked it up with practiced efficiency. The dispatcher on the other end barely finished speaking before Fiona's face hardened. 18 soldiers, rollover accident, we're their only chance. She hung up, and for the first time that day, Fiona moved with purpose. She didn't glance at the young nurses in the hall or the junior surgeon scribbling notes in the corner. She was already thinking ahead, her mind shifting gears as the calm of routine was replaced by the sharp clarity of emergency. She turned to Maria, the young nurse who had been following her like a shadow. "Get the crash cart ready," she said. Maria's eyes widened. "Is it really that bad?" "We don't have time to think, Maria. We act." As the heavy diesel engines roared outside, Fiona felt a flicker of something. Like a spark inside her, one that had been dormant for too long. The storm wasn't just outside the building anymore. It was inside, too. By the time the ambulance bay doors swung open, the hospital had already descended into chaos. The blizzard outside had transformed the world into a white blur, but it was the 18 soldiers being wheeled into the ER that now blurred the edges of everything. Fiona Jenkins was no longer just a nurse. She was a medic again. She was a leader again. The soldiers came in like a flood, some carried, some limping, all bloodied, broken and bruised. There was no room for hesitation. Fiona's hands moved with precision, instinct taking over as she sorted them into categories: immediate, urgent, walking wounded. Dr. Gregory Sterling, the arrogant young surgeon, stood frozen for a moment, staring at the whirlwind of chaos. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Fiona barely spared him a glance as she took control. "Sterling, get your hands in the game," she barked. He was the surgeon, but she had become the commander. He blinked, his face pale, and moved to a man with a compound fracture. But Fiona wasn't waiting for him. She stepped to the first patient, a soldier gasping for air. The diagnosis was quick: tension pneumothorax. Her hand shot out, grabbing the chest tube, and without a word, she was already working on him. No one said anything. No one questioned her. In the field, there were no questions, just actions. She turned to Maria, her voice steady. "Get me saline. We need to keep these men alive long enough for surgery." The air was thick with the scent of blood, antiseptic, and the desperation of men fighting to stay alive. As she worked, the walls of the ER seemed to dissolve. She wasn't in a hospital anymore. She was back in Fallujah, back in the heat of battle, but this time she wasn't fighting for her life. She was fighting for theirs. And for the first time in years, Fiona felt alive again. The chaos, the urgency, it was familiar. She knew what to do. She was Doc again. "Move him to Bay 2, she ordered without looking up. Maria obeyed without question. There was no time for hesitation, no time for doubt. The storm outside had cut them off from the rest of the world, but Fiona knew one thing: they were going to make it. All of them. "Let's work," she muttered to herself, wiping blood from her hands. The soldiers, injured and shaking, watched her. They knew something had shifted. They had found their leader in the grey-haired woman who moved like she was born for this. One by one, they stopped groaning. They started listening. And Fiona Jenkins knew for the first time in a long while that she was right where she belonged. The storm outside raged with fury, but inside St. Jude's, a different kind of storm was unfolding. Fiona Jenkins stood in the center of the ER, orchestrating a symphony of life-saving measures. The soldiers were being stabilized one by one, But Fiona's mind never stopped. She was already thinking ahead, calculating what the next moment would bring. Dr. Sterling had returned from surgery, sweat beading on his brow. His confidence was shaken. Fiona had seen it before, the look of a man who had never truly faced a real crisis, a real life-or-death situation. She could see the panic in his eyes, but she didn't have time to baby him. "Sterling, move it," she snapped. He jumped and hurried over to the next soldier. She didn't watch him. She was too busy. There was no room for doubt in her world now. She moved with swift precision, a medic in the thick of battle. But the storm was not over. The pressure on Fiona only grew as the hours stretched into the night. The soldiers, most of whom had seen death too many times, knew they were in good hands. It was something they could feel, even in their haze of pain. And that made them trust her without a single word spoken. Fiona glanced over her shoulder to where Maria stood, staring wide-eyed at the chaos. The young nurse was in over her head, but Fiona didn't have time for reassurances. "Stay focused," she said, her voice firm. "Don't look away. Keep your hands steady. These men are counting on you." Maria nodded and stepped forward, doing exactly as Fiona had instructed. But not all the soldiers were ready to follow orders. Some, like Master Sergeant Mallister, were fighters. Wounded but unbroken, he tried to stand, his determination obvious. Fiona had already seen enough of that attitude to know what it meant. "Don't get up, Sergeant," she commanded. "You're not walking anywhere." Mallister didn't flinch. "We fight, Doc, even when we're broken." Fiona only gave him a glance, but her heart clenched. These men were her people. She didn't have time to explain. She didn't need to. They knew what she could do, and for the first time in years, she was proud of that. She was proud of who she had become. But just as quickly, the feeling passed. There was no time for pride. There was only time for survival. "Miller's stabilizing," Maria reported, eyes wide with relief. "But the others, they're getting worse." Fiona didn't hesitate. "Get me more blood, now." As she barked orders, the reality of their situation hit her hard. The hospital was ill-equipped for this level of trauma. They had no more supplies coming, and the snowstorm was too severe to get anyone through the pass. The resources they had were running out fast. But Fiona had been in worse situations before, and she wasn't about to let any of these men die. As the room filled with the muffled sounds of chaos, Fiona took a deep breath. "Focus, one soldier at a time," she thought. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the next patient in need of attention. She wasn't going to let anyone fall through the cracks. Not on her watch. Fiona's hands never stopped moving. It was as if her body had become an extension of the hospital, her actions seamless and purposeful. Every soldier, every wound, every decision flowed through her with a deadly precision that made her seem more like a machine than a human. She moved from patient to patient, checking vitals, administering what little medication they had left, and working with the same focus she had in the desert. But even Fiona couldn't ignore the weight pressing on her chest. They were running out of blood. The saline wasn't enough. The cold in the room was cutting through her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The crash cart was a blur, with each drawer being opened and closed with meticulous care. Dr. Sterling was still struggling with his patients, hesitating at every turn. His arrogance was gone now, replaced by confusion. Fiona didn't have time to hold his hand. She wasn't there to teach him anymore. She was there to save lives. Maria, shaking, handed her more supplies, but Fiona could see the fear in her eyes. Maria had never been in a situation like this before. She was still learning the ropes of civilian medicine. "Get me more IVs," Fiona snapped, her voice firm. She had no time to explain. The young nurse moved without question, and Fiona continued working, her hands steady despite the storm of adrenaline coursing through her. But even Fiona could see the panic slowly creeping into the room. She glanced over at Master Sergeant Mallister, who had returned to his bed after the ordeal. He was looking at her with something like reverence. The soldiers were starting to see her for what she was, not just the quiet nurse who cleaned up after them. "You know, Doc," Mallister said, his voice hoarse, "you've saved us more than once tonight." Fiona didn't respond. She didn't have time for gratitude. She had time for survival, and that's what she was doing, surviving. She was doing what she had been trained to do, keeping them alive long enough for the storm to pass, long enough for help to come. But there was no help coming. Not tonight, and that knowledge hit her like a cold slap to the face. It was just them now, and they would survive, or they wouldn't. As the hours dragged on, fatigue set in. Fiona's hands trembled slightly as she held the IV in place for another soldier, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The storm raged outside, and in that moment it wasn't just a blizzard. It was the storm inside her, the storm she had been running from for 2 decades. It had caught up to her, and now she had to face it, one soldier at a time, one decision at a time. "Get me more blood," she said again. "We're not done yet." The storm outside was relentless, but inside the ER the battle was just as fierce. The soldiers were beginning to stabilize, but the pressure was far from over. Fiona's body ached with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp, focusing only on the task at hand. Dr. Sterling had recovered some of his confidence, but Fiona could see the cracks beneath the surface. He wasn't cut out for this, not like she was. The reality of mass trauma was different from the textbooks, but Fiona didn't have time to hold his hand. She had soldiers to save. "How's the chest tube?" she asked, her voice steady as she moved past a soldier on a gurney, his face pale from blood loss. Maria, who had been following her every move, responded quickly. "It's stable for now, but he's going to need more blood soon." "We don't have more blood," Fiona muttered, her heart sinking as the weight of their situation settled in. "We do what we can with what we've got." She moved quickly, her hands working faster than her thoughts, but the longer she worked, the more she could feel the strain of the night taking its toll. The chaos was beginning to feel like a fog, and Fiona was struggling to keep herself grounded. She turned to Maria again. "Keep the walking wounded calm," she instructed. "Tell them to sit tight. Don't let them wander. This place is a minefield right now." As she spoke, her eyes flicked to the soldiers on the floor, their wounds ranging from minor to life-threatening. Some were talking quietly to one another, others lost in their own pain. But Fiona could see it in their eyes. They were all waiting for something, for her, for a miracle, and she wasn't sure she could deliver that. Not this time. The snow outside howled against the hospital's walls, but Fiona's focus never wavered. She moved from patient to patient, each one a new challenge, each one a new test of her skills. But despite the endless flow of work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick with tension, and Fiona could almost hear the weight of the storm pressing down on her shoulders. She glanced at the clock. It was nearing 3 a.m., and the exhaustion was starting to settle in her bones. But there was no time for rest. Not now, not when they were so close to the finish line. Then, without warning, the door to the ER burst open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the hallway. Fiona's eyes snapped up. More soldiers. The situation was about to get worse. The doors to the ER slammed open again, and the fresh wave of soldiers poured in like a tidal wave. Fiona barely glanced up as the trauma teams began working, their movements frantic and disorganized. Her focus remained unbroken, a laser beam in a room full of noise. She moved to the first patient with a compound fracture, hands already anticipating the pressure needed to stabilize him. But she was quickly reminded of the escalating chaos when Dr. Sterling's voice cracked through the frenzy. "We're losing him," Sterling shouted, his face pale with panic as he worked on one of the soldiers who had sustained severe internal injuries. Fiona didn't hesitate. Her feet moved quickly, driven by an impulse that had become second nature over the years. She knelt beside him, pushing Sterling aside with a firm hand. "Take a breath, doctor. You're panicking. Let's work." He opened his mouth to argue, but the look on her face made him pause. She didn't need to explain. She was taking over. The room was chaotic. Shouting paramedics, soldiers groaning in pain, the blinding white light from the overheads. But Fiona didn't hear any of it. She focused only on the task at hand, stabilizing this man before he bled out in front of them. "Maria, I need more blood," she barked. "Now!" The young nurse didn't question her. She ran, the soldier's pulse was fading, but Fiona wasn't ready to give up. She had never been ready to give up. She glanced at the clock, 3 hours since the first casualties arrived. They had no blood left, no way of getting more. They were out of time. But Fiona was used to being out of time. The trauma bay felt like a battlefield, and she was the only one who had the experience to survive it. "Prep for surgery," she ordered to Dr. Sterling, who was still frozen in the corner, staring at the soldiers like they were all ghosts. He nodded, swallowing hard. "What do we do?" "We do what we have to," Fiona replied. "Now, let's move. We're losing him." Together, they worked. Sterling, unsure but willing to follow her lead, did as Fiona instructed. They fought in silence, each move deliberate. Fiona's hands were steady, her mind already calculating the next steps, while the world outside seemed to crash against the walls of the hospital. But as the minutes ticked by, Fiona's heart began to race. The soldiers, the ones who could still stand, were beginning to look to her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was their leader. She was the one they depended on. She had to keep them alive. She had to get them through this storm. She had to make sure they never knew what it was like to die in the snow. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders, but she didn't let it show. "Not now, not in front of them. Stay with me," she whispered to the soldier on the table. "I'm not leaving you." The hours dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. The storm outside had become a distant hum, drowned out by the more immediate crisis unfolding within the walls of St. Jude's. Fiona Jenkins moved like a force of nature, her every action deliberate, each decision made with the precision of a seasoned combat medic. The ER was no longer just a hospital. It was a battlefield, and Fiona was its commander. The room was a blur of activity. Paramedics, soldiers, doctors, nurses, all working under the strain of a broken system, a makeshift medical team trying to cope with the impossible. And yet Fiona didn't flinch. She had seen worse. She had lived through worse. Dr. Sterling, the young surgeon who had once looked down on her, was now following her lead. His earlier arrogance replaced with fear. Fiona didn't take pleasure in it. This wasn't a time for pride or satisfaction. She was just doing her job. But as she moved between patients, her heart pounded louder. Not from exhaustion, but from a growing sense of something darker creeping through the air. She glanced around, her gaze falling on Master Sergeant Mallister, who was sitting upright, his eyes bloodshot but steady. His injuries had been stabilized, but he wasn't resting. No, he was watching her, and something about his quiet observation unnerved her. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't gratitude, it was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Doc," he called out, his voice low but clear, "I've been in combat a long time, but I've never seen anything like this." Fiona didn't acknowledge him. She couldn't. She had to keep moving. But the words gnawed at her. He wasn't talking about the storm. He wasn't talking about the blizzard. He was talking about her, about what she was doing. And for the first time in years, Fiona wondered if she had truly left the battlefield behind. But the thought was fleeting. There was no time to dwell on the past, not now, not when lives were at stake. "We need to move, Sterling," she barked, her voice snapping through the room. The surgeon was still fumbling with his instruments, his earlier panic resurfacing. He had saved the femur case, but now he looked lost, like a man in too deep. Fiona wasn't there to coddle him, she was there to save lives. "Sterling!" Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Get it together!" The surgeon stiffened, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of fear and respect. He nodded, his hands steadying as he prepared for the next surgery. Fiona turned back to the chaos, her eyes scanning the room. More soldiers, more wounds, more lives hanging in the balance. She wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance. "We're not done yet," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "We're not done." The blizzard outside was a relentless force, but it paled in comparison to the pressure building inside the ER. Fiona's mind raced as she moved from patient to patient, each one an urgent puzzle to solve. The storm outside was a threat, but it was nothing compared to the one inside. She could feel it in her bones. The weight of responsibility, the unspoken truth that each decision could mean life or death. "Maria, prep the saline gas," she calls her dad. Her voice calm but firm. The young nurse responded immediately, moving with a practiced grace that had been absent just hours before. They were all learning fast, adapting to the chaos. But there was a cost. Fiona felt the weight of it in her body, in the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she reached for the next piece of medical equipment. She didn't have time to think about it. There was no space for weakness in the storm they were in. The soldiers, the men who had once seen her as nothing more than a quiet nurse, were beginning to look at her differently now. Fiona wasn't just a caregiver to them. She was the one who would keep them alive. Doc, Mallister's voice broke through the haze of her thoughts. He was sitting upright again, despite the heavy bandages wrapped around his body. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Fiona didn't answer him at first. She wasn't sure what to say. The words seemed hollow in her mouth. Instead, she continued moving through the room, her eyes scanning for the next emergency, the next patient in need. There was no time for doubts, no time for answers that couldn't be given. The door opened again, and Fiona turned sharply, already bracing herself for what she knew was coming. Another soldier, another body to be dealt with. But this one was different. The man who stepped through the door was not someone Fiona had expected to see. His uniform was torn, his face covered in blood, but it wasn't the physical wounds that stopped her cold. It was the recognition in his eyes, the recognition that cut through her like a blade. "Fiona?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. "Is it really you?" The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought she would ever see him again. Not after everything. Not after what had happened. "Jack." The name slipped from her lips, barely a whisper. But there was no time to dwell on the past. Not now. Not with 18 men waiting for her to save them. But as Fiona moved to him, her mind was racing. Jack. Her husband. The man who had died in the crash. The man who had been lost to her years ago. She turned her focus back to the chaos in the ER, pushing the memories away. There was no room for the past. There was only the present. And in this moment, the only thing that mattered was saving lives. "We need to move," she said, her voice sharp. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it, no matter what. The hours passed in a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Fiona moved like a machine, every action precise and calculated. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the ER it was a different kind of storm, one of life and death. The soldiers were hanging on, their faces pale but determined. Fiona could see it in their eyes, the will to survive, the same will that had kept her alive all those years ago. She moved from one patient to the next, her hands steady despite the fatigue gnawing at her. Each soldier was a new challenge, a new puzzle to solve. But Fiona didn't hesitate. She didn't allow herself to hesitate. As she worked, she could feel the weight of their dependence on her. They were trusting her, and she wasn't about to let them down. The sound of shuffling feet and muffled voices filled the room, but Fiona barely noticed. Her focus was sharp, and her mind was calculating every move before it even happened. "Dr. Sterling, take the next one," Fiona called out, her voice cutting through the tension. He nodded, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The man was talented, no doubt, but he was still learning the true meaning of pressure. She had long since learned to operate under pressure. It had become second nature to her. But there was a cost to that kind of experience. "Doc, I need you here." Maria's voice broke through her thoughts, and Fiona turned quickly, her gaze snapping to the young nurse. Maria's hands were trembling as she held a soldier's IV line in place, her face pale with fear. "What's wrong?" Fiona asked, moving to her side. Maria didn't respond right away, her eyes darting nervously between Fiona and the patient. The soldier was pale, his blood pressure dropping rapidly. Fiona's eyes scanned his body, searching for the cause. "He's bleeding internally," she said quietly. "We need more blood, Maria. Now." Maria's hands were shaking as she moved to the blood bank. But Fiona's attention never wavered. The soldier needed her. They all needed her. As the minutes ticked by, Fiona felt the strain of the night weigh on her. The storm had become a distant memory, a backdrop to the chaos that was unfolding within the hospital. But despite the exhaustion, Fiona never slowed. She couldn't, she wouldn't. The soldiers needed her. They were all counting on her. And Fiona wasn't about to let them down. She was no longer just the quiet nurse in the corner. She was the one they depended on. And she would save them all, or die trying. The storm outside began to wane, but inside St. Jude's, the aftermath of the night's chaos still hung thick in the air. The ER was quieter now, the frantic pace of the past few hours beginning to ebb. Fiona Jenkins stood at the center of it all, surrounded by the remnants of what had been a battle for survival. The soldiers she had worked tirelessly to save were now resting, their injuries being tended to with the kind of care they had never expected from a civilian nurse. Dr. Sterling had become a different person, his arrogance replaced by a newfound respect, not just for Fiona, but for the brutal reality of medicine under fire. "You did it," he said quietly. his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. Fiona looked at him, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. There were no words for what had transpired in the last 12 hours. The lives saved, the decisions made. It was all too much for words. The soldiers, most of them still alive but barely, were now settled in the recovery rooms, their faces drawn with the pain of what they had endured. They were all awake now, their eyes locked onto Fiona with a kind of reverence that made her uncomfortable. She wasn't a hero, she wasn't a doctor. She was just someone who did what had to be done. But in that moment, Fiona realized something. She wasn't just the nurse anymore. She wasn't the woman hiding from her past. She had faced the storm, not just outside the hospital, but inside herself. And for the first time in years, she could feel that old part of herself waking up. The part that had been buried under years of grief, of loss. The part of her that had once been Doc, the medic who saved lives in the face of death. That part of her was still there, and it was time to stop running from it. As she stood in the quiet of the ER, watching the morning light creep through the windows, Fiona felt the weight of the night settle into her bones. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. But as she looked at the soldiers who were still alive, still breathing, she knew one thing: they had all made it through, and she had led them there. "I'm done running," she whispered to herself, the words soft but steady. "I'm done hiding." The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn, and she saw Dr. Sterling standing there, a cup of coffee in his hand. "You know," he said, his voice still tinged with disbelief, "the job is open. I think you'd be a hell of a trauma surgeon." Fiona shook her head slightly, a dry smile curling on her lips. "I'm not a surgeon, Greg. I'm a nurse." "No, you're not," he replied, his gaze steady and sincere. "You're a damn good doctor." Fiona didn't answer him. She didn't have to. The truth was in her hands now. It had always been there. "Let's get to work," she said quietly, turning back to the ER. The storm outside had passed, but a new kind of storm had begun within her. And for the first time in a long time, Fiona Jenkins, Doc as they now called her, was ready to face it. As the sun rose higher, a new day began, and Fiona was no longer hiding from it. Если эта история тронула вас эмоционально, подпишитесь на наш канал, напишите свое мнение в комментариях и поделитесь этим видео с другими.